So this is chapter 4. We set up the stage last time for having a revolution, and more importantly, a revolution that succeeds. You have to have the right type of people, and we did. We had the right demographics in America, not in 1700, but by 1770 we certainly did, and particularly those three large groups, the convicts, the Germans, and the Scots-Irish and Scots-Irish. Particularly the last group, who were, as one book titles it, born fighting and continued fighting. They are the backbone of the revolution. We are moving on. I want to look at slide number 7. Before we get into the change in ideas, definitely need to look at the other factors. One key factor is that America is a long way from England. If it had been next door, it might have been a different story, but you have 3,000 miles of ocean. It took roughly 2 to 3 months in either direction. So if you're going to exchange information or change orders or get supplies, it is roughly 5 to 6 months round trip to do so. That makes a difference. It's also out of sight, out of mind. America is not on the front burner for the kings of England, and you will see below that the three kings of England. You have basically neglect by the kings. Their mind is on other things. You have George I, who ascended to the throne roughly right after 1700, George II, his son, George III, his grandson. George I and II are German. The House of Tudor had died out, and the British had a choice between a French prince and a German prince, both related to their ancestors. And they decided, the French being hereditary enemies, let's pick this little prince from a small German principality from Hanover. So the British royal house today, Elizabeth and her children, they are not hereditarily English, they are actually German. The first two, George I and II, were immigrants. They came, they spoke no English. They were raised in Germany. So how much are they going to be on top of what's going on in politics and foreign affairs? Not at all. And in addition, their main concern was not government. Their main concern was wine, women, and song. The last one, George III, in that wonderfully yellow, gold, and ermine outfit of his, was also interested in wine, women, and song, but much less so. He actually spoke English. He tried to keep a hand on what was going on in government. The problem with George III is that he had bouts of temporary insanity. He'd be totally sane, and then the next day you would see him up on the roof trying to fly like a bird, or talking to the cows in the pasture or whatever, and he'd be totally nuts for like 5 and 6 months, and then be sane again. So this went in and out, but this is going on while things are leading up to the revolution and during the revolution. So although he meant well and he spoke English, he was not altogether there all the time. This is helpful for us because we don't have a king that is actively and seriously involved with what is going on with the colonies. He checks in and out. Okay, so I'm moving down to slide number 11. And you have a revolutionary change in ideas. You cannot have the revolution without the Enlightenment. That has to come first. And the whole world changes after about 1700. Certainly Europe changes because you have what they call the Enlightenment, the age of reason, the age of science, the age of criticism. It was also called the Scottish Enlightenment because one of the headquarters was in Edinburgh. Edinburgh University today is still one of the leaders in science, by the way. They are Presbyterian, they are Calvinist. Everybody reads the Bible in lowland Scotland. The goal of the Enlightenment, to enlighten men's minds. This is what we recognize as the modern world. This is the rise of science. And I always think of the little illustration of this as a light bulb above a guy's head. You are bringing light to men's minds. Exactly. So what does a man of the Enlightenment believe? Number one, God is not omnipotent. He is not all powerful. This is where free will comes in with a vengeance, okay? And again, they use the metaphor, and it's just perfect. They talked about the watchmaker God. God is a guy who puts together the watch, he winds it up, and then he lets it go. So they are not atheists. They absolutely believe God created the world and everything in it. But once he created the world, he also created our minds and reason as a faculty of man. And then he let us go and gave us the free will to use our minds. Okay, because the individual has power here and everything is not in the hands of God, the individual can determine his own fate. This is optimistic as opposed to Puritan pessimistic. You have the power to determine your life. This is what we recognize as the modern world here. It is your job to use the brains and the rationality that God gave you to discover God's laws. And where are God's laws? They are not looking to the Bible, although they don't throw the Bible out. God's laws are not in the Bible, particularly not in the Old Testament. They are in nature. You go out, you experiment, you observe, and you find God's laws because God, of course, created everything. So he's going to make his rules out there. All you have to do is go out and find them. Motto of the Enlightenment, dare to know. Go out, explore, observe, and find God's laws in the world around you. Now, this is incredibly radical because you can see right away why this changes everything. Because you go out and determine the rules. The rules are not given to you by a king or given to you by a church. This is bottom up, not top down, if you want to make a diagram here. So, immediately, it is applied in slide number 12 to everything, and it changes everything, at least in Europe. So the Enlightenment, first thing it is applied to, because it came out of science, actually Isaac Newton is a key figure. In 1687, he wrote a huge treatise on the laws of gravity and motion. If you remember Isaac Newton, and the apple fell from the tree, and he discovered gravity. Okay, so now we have laws of science. And if you remember in fourth grade, those wonderful science fair projects that you had, this is the origin of them. You experiment, and if you remember, you had a hypothesis, an idea. And then what do you do with a science fair project in fourth grade? You go ahead, you gather data, you experiment, and then you draw a conclusion, which may or may not match your hypothesis. And then you can do it again or variations on it. This is exactly what is going on in the Enlightenment after 1700. You invent, you experiment, you accumulate knowledge. This is the scientific method. Not authority from somebody on high, but your data from below. Once Isaac Newton does this, two of the key figures in America, Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin, both world-renowned scientists. And I'll give you a key metaphor, and it's Ben Franklin's. He was hugely and more popular in Europe than he was in America. I'll talk about him in a minute. But good example of an Enlightenment mind. Ben Franklin, old age, he is going on a diplomatic mission back to England. It is a winter crossing of the Atlantic. There are storms all the way. He's 80-some years old. He has gout. His joints ache. He has a cold. He's miserable. He's seasick. He's puking over the side of the boat half the time. He's an old man. And he comes back. He sails from London to Philadelphia, his home. He gets off the boat in Philadelphia, and during this miserable, horrible passage, Ben Franklin has written a 60-page pamphlet on how to improve navigation and ship design. That's a man of the Enlightenment. You have a problem, you go out, you experiment, you observe, and you come up with a better way. A Puritan in the same position, or anybody from the Middle Ages in the same position, would have been on his knees on the ship praying to God to end the storms and get you safely back. Ben Franklin wasn't on his knees during the voyage. He was experimenting, testing, and observing so he could improve other voyages for other passengers later. That's a man of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment went ahead and was applied to religion. And we have a new religion for your chart here. The religion is deism, D-E-I-S-M. Deism comes from the Latin word for God, which is deus. This is a very rational Christianity. This is the Enlightenment applied to religion. And again, how do you find God? Not through the Bible, but through nature, through observation and nature. The title, the religion's name, tells you what they believe in. Deism. A deist believes in God. These are not atheists. There is a God. Period. Not sure about anything else. The Jesus thing, not so sure about. They leave it open. This is Ben Franklin writing in his old age, and he says it much better than I could possibly put it. Listen carefully to his, this is a perfect definition of deism. Here is my religion. I believe in one God, creator of the universe, that he governs it by his providence, that he ought to be worshipped, that the most acceptable service we give to him is doing good to his other children, be charitable, in other words, that the soul of man is immortal and will be treated with justice in another life, respecting its conduct in this. So this is free will. God will judge you based on what you do in this life. Okay, quote, these I take to be the fundamental principles of all sound religion, and I regard them as you do in whatever religion I meet with them. All religions have this, he says. Now, be careful here. Quote, as to Jesus of Nazareth, my opinion of whom you particularly desire, I think the system of morals and his religion as he left them to us the best the world ever saw or is likely to see. But I see that it has received various corrupting changes, and I have, with most of the present dissenters in England, some doubts as to his divinity. Though it is a question I do not teach on, never having studied it, and I think it is needless to busy myself with it now, when I expect soon an opportunity of knowing the truth with much less trouble. He's a very sly fox. He says, I'm not going to worry about it because I'm going to die soon, and then we'll find out about Jesus. So what does a deist believe in? He just told you. I believe in God, period. Free will. Not sure about anything else. So here's the catch, and this is a huge issue today in American politics and American society. Are deist Christians? No, they are not teaching Christ. They don't throw him out. They do use a Bible, but they believe in God, period. The Jesus thing, not so sure about. Okay, this is very important because all of our founding fathers, every single one of them, called themselves and identified and wrote about being deists. They did not write about being Christians. So when they talk about the founding fathers and a Christian nation, absolutely the vast majority of people who came were Christians. No question about it, with rare exceptions. But the people who wrote the Constitution, Thomas Jefferson, who was famous for writing the Declaration of Independence, they said openly, we are deists. We are not necessarily followers of Christ. Thomas Paine's great book that sold 17 editions in 2 years in Europe and America, The Age of Reason. The Age of the Enlightenment. If a Puritan had written the same book at the same time, he would have said the age of Christ, the age of religion. So everything changes then. And this, of course, means that you have separation of church and state. The founding fathers, I've read a lot about them. I'm not the only one who says this. They were deists. They openly said that. They did not identify themselves as Christian. And these are the people who wrote the Constitution, who wrote the Declaration, who put the country together. So be careful when you hear people say America is a Christian nation. Yes and no. Depends on how you define that. Okay. The last application is probably the most important, which is the application of the Enlightenment to politics, the laws of nature applied to government. And again, this is the age of reason. Reason is necessary to improve men and society. Again, education, of course, is vital to help educate and improve men's conditions. This is when you have journals and newspapers and colleges all over the place. The key figure here, and you've probably heard his name before if you haven't studied in politics, this is the time, is John Locke, who actually lived in Edinburgh, by the way, and Locke on the end. And he writes in 1690, Essay Concerning Human Understanding. So by 1700, these ideas are widespread. By the time of the Revolution, everybody in Western Europe, everybody in America believes in John Locke's ideas. What did he say? According to the Enlightenment, all men, did he mean all women too? Probably. All people have natural rights to life, liberty, and he did not say pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson had to change that. John Locke said life, liberty, and property. Jefferson changed it because, of course, if you're talking about property, you would be talking about slavery, and that was a huge issue in the Declaration, and he changed it to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Who gave you these rights? God. If God gave you these rights, who can take them away? Only God. This is the beginning, the kickstart to the women's rights movement, to the abolition of slavery movement, to rights for Native Americans. It's slow. It takes a while, particularly for women. So Locke said, God gave you these rights, only God can take them away. When men join together in governments, you don't lose your natural rights because God gave them to you. The government cannot take them away from you. Okay? Men join together in a government, and they, partly to regulate the society, they elect a king or have a king or elect a government to protect and uphold these rights. If the king does not protect your rights to life, liberty, and property, you can withdraw your consent to the government, and you can get rid of the king and get another. So this is incredibly radical, because up to this point, what did everybody think kings got their power from? From God. Locke says kings do not get their power from God. They don't get it from up above. They get it from below. They get it from us, the people, because we make a contract with the king. If he doesn't uphold his end, get rid of him, get a new government. Kings get their power from the consent of the governed. Government exists for the welfare of the people, not the welfare of the king. This is incredibly radical, and it's widely accepted after 1700. This is why you can't have really a revolution before 1700. It's certainly not a successful one. The British, it's a good thing we were a British colony because they had already exiled a king and beheaded another one for not being good kings, even before Locke wrote. And Locke is writing almost at the same time as the Glorious Revolution in England. They deposed James III, and Parliament ruled without a king for about 20 years in England. So thank goodness we were a British colony, because other people's colonies took a lot longer. There was a long tradition in England of opposition to the king. So we have the Enlightenment in science, in religion, in politics. Part of this becomes the Great Awakening, slides 20 and 21. This is also part of the Enlightenment, a huge movement, a very American movement that makes it possible and leads straight to the revolution, was a religious revival. So political ideas changed, so did religious practices. Remember that North America is mixed religions from the start. Unlike Europe, unlike South America, which is all Catholic, Canada is also all Catholic. In the North American British colonies, there were a dozen different religions. The South was mainly Anglican, New England was Puritan, Pennsylvania, New York had 6 kinds of German dissenters, religious groups, plus, of course, the Quakers, and then you had all kinds of different things going on, okay? So, conveniently, right before the Revolution, 1730, 1740, in all the colonies, in all economic classes, you have the Great Awakening. And again, like the little light bulb, this is to awaken one's soul. And it is a revival movement, a return to religious practice. People had fallen away. They were pursuing economic gain, very American. There had been some epidemics right before this. There was also, which we never hear about, in 1727, a pretty major earthquake in North America, and people were really scared by this, and basically they began to turn back to religion. In England, you have another split off that Protestant tree. You have John Wesley, who forms, many of you can connect the word, the Methodists. What are the Methodists? What's their difference? They're kind of going back to Roger Williams and Ann Hutchinson. You depend on God's grace alone. You experience God directly. Now, the difference was not necessarily through the Bible, in nature. Literacy was not a vital thing like it was for the Puritans, but this was a religion that depended on an emotional context. The Puritans are purely a mental religion. You study the Bible, you debate it, you try and determine what God's laws are. Wesleyan Methodists depended on emotion. You feel God. Today, we would call it your come to Jesus moment. You will know what the Wesleyans experience next Friday as you take your first exam. Come to Jesus. So they want people to come back to basic religion. The great figure here in America, the ideas were exported, becomes Jonathan Edwards. He is and was and still is America's greatest religious thinker. And he took the Wesley Methodism and spread it in America and created an American version, which became the Baptists. And the Baptists are a truly American religion. We invented this and exported it around the world. So, what did Jonathan Edwards teach? Emotional connection to God, not a rational connection. You don't learn God, you don't come to God through your mind, you come to him through your heart. God is in nature, so nature is not evil. Nature is good because God created it. God can't create bad things. The Baptist, what is the difference between Baptists and other Protestant sects? The Baptists believe in, and that's why they're called Baptists, in adult baptism. Now, Catholics baptized, I was baptized as a Greek Orthodox, they baptized babies. The difference with the Baptists is the Baptists believe you have to accept the teachings of the church to join the church as an active member, as an adult. So you also have on many church signs in Austin and all over the country, Free Will Baptist. This is a Free Will Baptist church. You individually choose to accept or reject Christ yourself. And when you accept him, you will be baptized as an adult because you understand the teachings. Okay? Especially on the frontier, especially in the western parts of the colonies, this spread like wildfire. They have camp meetings. Remember, it's the only show in town, too. People got together. They listened to sermons by traveling ministers. They had outdoor tent meetings. I think I have a picture of one there. We still do this. You can still see tents by the side of the road, even around Austin. And Friday, Saturday, Sunday, they have tent meetings, revival meetings. These are come to Jesus meetings. Find your religion again. They had congregations, groups of 10 to 25,000, particularly in Tennessee and Kentucky. The largest town in western Kentucky was 2,000 people, and yet they had gatherings of 10 to 25,000 people. You had itinerant ministers. One of the key ones was Isaac Backus. I will not ask you his name. He is the guy who really founded the Baptist in America. He had a conversion experience. He talked to God. God told him, go forth and preach, save souls. And he spent the rest of his life on close to 1,000 different trips over 1,500 miles a year on horseback and on foot. He gave over 10,000 sermons, 4 to 5 a week in different places, and converted tens of thousands of people to the Baptist religion. It became huge in America very, very quickly. Well before the Revolution, by 1754, states recognized the Baptists as a separate religion and said they could collect state taxes for that religion as well as the Anglican and other religions. The effect, of course, is the same as the Enlightenment, because this is an Enlightenment movement. The effect is the same. It is today's evangelical Protestantism. It is anti-authority, anti-aristocratic. It is anti-East Coast, where the establishment was. It is not anti-literacy, but literacy is not necessary. You have to feel God with your heart. So, again, this is from the bottom. Anybody could join. The real danger with the Baptists and Methodists is anybody could join. What do you do in the South with slaves? They were considered having equal souls, and women, of course. It's incredibly democratic because you yourself choose. You are in control of your fate. And like the Enlightenment, it is anti-authority. Power comes from the bottom and not the top down. Thanks. I'm going to end there, and we will go on. And, I think I'll end there. Okay. Thank you, and stay safe.